author, Dr. Matthew Frakes, and our moderator, Dr. Brian Ballow. So Matthew Frakes is a historian of American foreign relations and U.S. national security, and is an assistant professor here in the Chase Center at The Ohio State University. His research focuses on understanding the evolution of America's role in the world and how American leaders have framed their strategies and made decisions at moments of global change. Matt earned his PhD in history from the University of Virginia, where he held several fellowships, including one at the Jefferson Scholars Foundation and at the Batten School's National Security Policy Center. Before arriving at Ohio State, Matt was an America in the World Consortium postdoc fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. His first book, subject of today's event, Rogue States, The Making of America's Global War on Terror, is published 1 month ago today by Cornell University Press. This book explores the origins of the post-Cold War strategy in response to emerging transnational security threats of rogue states, terrorism, and weapons of mass destruction from the early Reagan years to the aftermath of the Gulf War. Brian Ballow is a historian of 20th century U.S. politics and American political development, history of media and politics, and environmental history. He is a professor of history emeritus at the University of Virginia, where he taught for over 30 years. He earned his PhD in history from Johns Hopkins University. And Brian is a very accomplished scholar and teacher, somebody whom Matt and I benefited from tremendously during our time at UVA. He's the author of many books. I'll name two: Government Out of Sight, The Mystery of National Authority in 19th Century America, and his most recent book, Not in My Backyard, How Citizen Activists Nationalized Local Politics in the Fight to Save Green Springs, which was published in 2024. Brian is also an incredibly dedicated teacher and mentor. He's influenced countless undergraduate and graduate students on the art of effective teaching over the course of his career. And he's also one of the famed hosts of the popular radio and podcast show Backstory with the American History Guys, which explores the history behind the headlines. Definitely recommend listening if you haven't. Just like Matt and I, Brian has traded in the mountains of Virginia for Ohio, where he currently resides up near Cleveland. He is a coordinator for the Citizens for Efficient Courts and a research fellow with Towards Employment. I'm sure we'll have a robust and full discussion this afternoon, so please join me in welcoming Matt and Brian.
Hey, Matt.
So, Brianna, thank you for that very, I would say, overly generous introduction, the part about me. And thank you all for inviting me to this forum. It's really an honor to be back with Matt. I'm used to seeing him from across the seminar table, across the colloquium table, and it's a really honor to be sharing the stage with him. Well, I would say stage. I live in Cleveland Heights, and neither of us are, my wife and I, we are not native Clevelanders or Ohioans. And our favorite party game for months after moving to Cleveland was visiting all the places with heights in them and actually looking for any rise in elevation. Whatsoever, we nominated Highland Heights as our favorite place in the Cleveland area. So I think it's befitting that here on the podium there is no podium.
That's right. Up on the heights.
What I hope we can do today is have a conversation about a model work of scholarship. It is a monograph. Brianna's right. I've worked with a lot of young scholars, and simply in terms of the way this book is written, the clarity, the precision of the argument, not to mention the research really could teach a lot of my former graduate students, and probably me as well, how to write clearly. But of course, the most important thing in scholarship is one's scholarly contribution. I hope that we can talk a bit about that right now. I'll simply say in advance that Matt makes a very important intervention into a pretty crowded field. Even in its narrowest sense, it's pretty crowded. The world of Cold War scholarship, even the end of Cold War scholarship. I hang out with a lot of the people who have written that scholarship, and I think Matt's intervention to reconceptualize the period of the 1980s through the mid-1990s as the beginning, rather than debating over what kind of end it was, is a very fresh way to look at the period. And like all good scholarship, I think it is going to spawn a lot of criticism, and that's a good thing in scholarship, and spawn a lot of work that will follow on and fill out the framework that Matt lays out. So how many of you are historians? Don't be embarrassed. Don't be embarrassed. We historians like to kind of understand where things come from. And so I thought we could begin by, and I'll ask you, Matt, to just tell us briefly, what was your path to this fine work of scholarship?
Well, thank you, and thanks to everyone for being here today. And it's an honor to be up with Brian Ballo, who, as Brianna and Brian have mentioned, he's been there and watching this project and my own trajectory from the beginning, and guided it in what hopefully has ended in good directions and good places. But it's of course both exciting and humbling to get to share the finished product of a long road of scholarship and writing and revision with a wider public now, coming from the carols of a library now out into the world. And of course, this is a project that took shape over the time of my studies in graduate school and in the years since. And I guess maybe a good origin point is really when I was a younger school child. One of the first memories I have, besides the 2000 World Series, of the wider world beyond my own little sphere, was of course the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And I of course didn't completely understand what they meant at the time, but I do remember having the clear impression that I was living through something that was historical, history in the making. Important things were happening at that point, and I think that planted the seed to try to understand what it meant, where it came from. And then fast forward to my my more scholarly studies, and I began with this project looking into what I found to be a fascinating period of the end of the Cold War, which of course is a well-trodden territory for scholars. But I focused in on one particular crisis, the American decision to bomb Libya in 1986, which stood out as one of the few moments where the military was used in conflict in this final decade of the Cold War. And as I delved further into that crisis, I started to come across terms that were being used that I associated with a later period, things like regime change, rogue states, terrorism as an act of war rather than a crime, preemptive military action. All of these phrases, all of these concepts started to crop up during this earlier period when I, of course, associated them with the post-9/11 world, George W. Bush. And so as I delved deeper, I found that this final decade of the Cold War was a really fruitful time for understanding the origins of the strategies that would animate America's role in the world after the Cold War, and especially after 9/11.
Great, thank you. So really picking up right there, what? I tried to sum up what I thought were some of your contributions. Something tells me you can do a better job. Why don't you tell these folks what you think your major contributions to the historiography are?
Well, hopefully so. As I've said, the end of the Cold War is a period of flux, a transitionary period, but one that's usually talked about with respect to, of course, the Cold War, the confrontation between America and the Soviet Union, the democratic capitalism versus communism, and it's seen as a period of ending, a wrapping up time, one that could have ended in global conflict, but unexpectedly ended peacefully. And what my book tries to do is to understand this period that's traditionally seen as an ending, actually as the start of something new, a period of building and not just wrapping up, not just tearing down. And so for this book, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the crumbling of the communist empire are the headlines, but percolating underneath that surface were a lot of critical transnational security threats that were only starting to bubble to the surface. And so what I try to understand is how American leaders in particular, American policymakers, started to understand these new types of threats that didn't really fit into the Cold War. Things like terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, rogue states, and narcotics trafficking, as they rose from being kind of peripheral nuisances into first-order threats in their own right. And within the history world, especially the Cold War history world, there's a growing band of scholarship that looks at what I would call the global Cold War. And so the idea behind this is that some of the most critical developments of the Cold War years were not just the rivalry between America and the Soviet Union, not just that traditional Cold War, but a host of issues like decolonization, like modernization, economic issues, and so on that didn't quite fit into the confines of the Cold War, but that transformed the world as much, or perhaps even more than that. And so my work kind of expands that growing field to look at these new types of national security threats that didn't fit into the traditional narrative and framework of the Cold War. And so that's one element. And then another thing is to look at 9/11, in addition to the end of the Cold War, as not a complete breaking point. Another thing that inspired my research was listening to interviews, documentaries, where George W. Bush and his key officials around 9/11 speak of the world completely changing on 9/11, and of course, in many ways, it certainly did. But so many of the strategies and the issues and the thinking that went into what would come after 9/11 had their origins in this earlier period. And so I suppose I break down not only the end of the Cold War as an ending point, but also 9/11 as a beginning point to show the through lines from the earlier period right up through our current day, of course.
Mm-hmm. And well, I think we have another historian in the room, so I'll go ahead and ask about periodization. I was surprised that, since you attribute a lot of importance to Ronald Reagan, H.W. Bush, George Shultz, who advised them on foreign policy, the 1980s, slipping into the 1990s. I was surprised that the term rogue state was first used by Bill Clinton in the 1990s. So I want you to help me understand what is a rogue state and understand more about your periodization. Last time I checked, your title is Rogue States, but that term isn't actually used. By the time I was finished with your book, I really understood the title, but maybe you can explain to this audience your periodization and what is a rogue state?
Well, it's a great point. So the meat of the book focuses on the period from Ronald Reagan entering office in the early 80s and ends in the aftermath of the Gulf War. And as Brian pointed out, actually it wasn't until after that point that the term rogue states comes into widespread use during the Clinton administration. And so part of what I do is to trace the trajectory of this concept over the course of this decade of learning. And of course, I'm sure you won't be surprised that in graduate seminars, one of the most common suggestions and critiques I got was, well, how would you define rogue states? And of course, that's an important question. But as I've delved deeper into the research, I've actually found that there isn't a crystal clear definition, and that's part of the point. So to explain that, first I can give you a bit of a definition to help with the understanding. Rogue states, from their origins in this period in the 80s right up through today, blended a number of emerging security threats that each had their own backstories, each had their own histories, but over the course of the 80s increasingly converged into what American officials recognized as some kind of new single phenomenon. And so this included international terrorism, and in particular state-sponsored international terrorism. It included narcotics trafficking, which we often think of as kind of a separate issue, but in the 80s was part and parcel of this. Regional aggression, often very erratic aggression, and the pursuit and use of weapons of mass destruction. So all of these once separate dangers were converging together. But what I try to trace over the course of the book is how American leaders came to recognize these things and understand them. And so what I am more concerned with than what a theoretical definition of things like terrorism or rogue states should be is how American officials understood these emerging threats and how that understanding changed and evolved over time. Because this was a decade of learning, of adapting, and so one of the ironies, and I'm sure we'll delve more into this, is that sometimes countries that fit a rigid definition, as I've kind of laid it out for you, but weren't necessarily considered prime rogue states. Others were considered critical rogue states in this time period, but didn't share all of the same features. And of course, international troublemakers and pariahs are nothing new, nothing unique to this end of the Cold War period. But it was a combination of the cocktail of threats that I described mixed with the international context of a world order breaking down, the Cold War, which had kept international troublemakers in check for a period, the breakdown of those constraints and really the opening of a Pandora's box during this end of the Cold War transitionary period that brought this threat into a first order problem. So over the course of the 80s, this was a process of learning. And of course, under President Reagan, the first term that he used to describe this threat was outlaw states, international outlaws. And under George H.W. Bush, that evolved into the term renegade regimes and unpredictable rulers. And then, of course, that culminated with the catchiest of them all, which is rogue states, which is really the culminating point of the book, where I try to understand the creation of this framework, the creation of this new paradigm, as it finally crystallizes at the end of the story, at the end of the Cold War and Gulf War, into rogue states.
So I found myself wondering, was reading your book, and I kept thinking of the term non-state actors. This is not from my own work as a historian. It's from living through the period, and terrorists were non-state actors. That's certainly one of your very important categories. Narcotic drug dealers, narco-terrorists, and non-state actors. And then for your states, it often seemed to be less a state than an individual dictator, like Gaddafi. And so I found myself wondering, as the rogue state paradigm he loves in the book, and I think this is great, he used the verb stumbles a lot. They kind of stumbled into this understanding of the world. They kind of stumbled towards what foreign policy students might call a grand strategy. Mm-hmm. Grand strategies are supposed to come first, and then they're executed. In Matt's hands, this is how a grand strategy is formed: bumbling one's way into a grand strategy. But I mean, my question is probably very naive, but if states didn't exist, would the architects of the rogue state paradigm needed to invent them? And by that, it seems to me that what was also happening with the breakup of the Cold War was that all of a sudden, with globalization, which you talk about as well, where all of a sudden maybe states were not the perfect way to conduct international relations. I'm being somewhat facetious by saying, do they kind of need to invent states, or do they need to attach these apparently chaotic actions to state actors?
It's a great question, and I would say, of course, but perhaps not totally satisfying, but both yes and no. And so I would start and say that
we are in an academic setting, so
that's
I
true.
think
So you
yes
can argue
and
both
no
sides
is
of things.
almost required, wouldn't you say?
And a lot of the early books on rogue states that looked at this growing phenomenon, starting in the early 90s, argued that rogue states were just an invention of the United States. The U.S. needed a bad guy at the end of the Cold War. Or one version of the argument goes that the Defense Department was afraid of losing its budget after the fall of the Soviet Union, needed somebody to pit themselves against, and so this rogue state idea was crafted and created by the U.S. government and the Pentagon in particular at the end of the Cold War. And I've actually found that could not be further from the truth, which surprised me in some ways. Of course, the Pentagon was concerned about losing their budgets at the end of the Cold War, but one of the things that I found in studying the crises over the course of the 80s that were formative for this new rogue state idea is that each one came very unexpectedly for America. American policymakers in the Reagan and Bush 41 administration struggled and stumbled to figure out what these things meant. They were resistant to the idea that things like terrorism and rogue states should be first-order concerns, and yet each time they tried to shove them aside, these threats popped up again and again. And so now where I would say perhaps yes to the idea of inventing or attaching the non-state threats to state entities, has to do with trying to make some kind of sense out of each of these individual, non-Cold War, seemingly peripheral problems at the beginning of the decade of the 80s, and figuring out some cohesive, coherent way to attack them effectively. So for example, terrorism. Most of the terrorist attacks in the early and mid-1980s, which were growing in scale, were by non-state actors and loose terrorist organizations. And the Reagan administration really struggled with how to effectively approach this issue. And of course, the most famous and tragic episode from the early 1980s was the bombing of the Marine barracks, where Americans were stationed in Beirut, Lebanon, by a group that, when I was starting my project, very few of us might have heard of, but now should be a familiar name, which is Hezbollah. And Hezbollah was sponsored by Iran. But in the aftermath of this devastating bombing, which killed several hundred American service members, the Reagan administration, on one hand, wanted to strike back, but struggled to figure out how to do so effectively. Reagan didn't want to just indiscriminately bomb civilian centers where he didn't know it would have any effect on curbing the violence, but increasingly, as this terrorist violence escalated during the mid-'80s, Reagan recalibrated his approach and increasingly connected it to the sponsorship of the Libyan regime of Muammar Gaddafi, who Reagan called the mad clown of Tripoli. Reagan had his catchy monikers for just about everybody, certainly in this story. And Reagan and his advisors attached this non-state terrorist problem to the Libyan regime, in part because, of course, Gaddafi was sponsoring these terrorist attacks. And so it wasn't a purely invented way of looking at the problem. But to Reagan's mind, the approach of treating these terrorist attacks as crimes, issues for international law, was just not working. It wasn't curbing the threat. And by redefining terrorism as an act of war, by employing America's preponderance of military power, he could have more of an effect. And this strategy culminated with the bombing of Libya in 1986, which did, at least for a time, curb Libyan support for international terrorism. So it had a certain effect, but of course, as you say, this is something that originated as a non-state problem, only found traction in an American strategy as it became attached to states and rogue dictators that America could more clearly and effectively strike back at.
Mm-hmm. So Libya is really the first example of an American military action towards a state. They didn't use the term rogue state. Why don't you talk about the two other key examples in your book that followed sequentially?
That's right. So I followed three different rogue states, starting with Libya, and each one contributed a different characteristic to this threat that, as I said, was taking shape and evolving over the course of the decade. And so, as I said, the Libyan regime of Gaddafi fused this emerging idea of outlaw states with the sponsorship of international terrorism. But the two additional cases that I focus on expanded this emerging idea in new ways. So the first, and perhaps most surprising to me as I did my research, was the Panamanian regime of General Manuel Noriega, another name that had been relegated to history until recently, when events in Venezuela, of course, brought it back to the forefront. But Noriega's regime is one that I had not expected to play a central role in the development of this rogue state idea, because Panama was not seeking to build a nuclear weapon. It wasn't necessarily sponsoring terrorist organizations the way Gaddafi's regime was, but it was at the center of a growing international narcotics trafficking ring, and General Noriega was at the heart of this. And people like Reagan, and especially his Secretary of State, George Shultz, saw the growing international drug trade as intimately connected with the growing state sponsorship of terrorism, seeing a link between the funding that came from trading drugs toward terrorist organizations and toward state sponsors of terrorism. And so Noriega's regime contributed the characteristic of narcotics trafficking, and perhaps more importantly, contributed the idea of an outlaw regime. Someone particularly at the head, the dictator Noriega himself, a criminal, illegitimate leader who, by the end of the Panama crisis, was arrested, had been indicted by American courts, much as Maduro has been recently, was detained by the American military and Drug Enforcement Administration, and brought back to the United States for trial and spent the rest of his life in jail. So he contributed this idea of criminal outlaw dictators running drugs and supporting terrorist states. And then, of course, the final and quintessential example of a rogue state was Iraq and the regime of Saddam Hussein. And this was also a bit of an ironic and unexpected story in the sense that for most of the 1980s, the Reagan administration was actually more or less supporting the Iraqi regime. And the reason for this is that Iraq was squaring off in a titanic war with Iran for essentially the entire decade. And when faced with these two regimes, Reagan felt that the Iranian regime was the greater of evils, and that Saddam Hussein's regime might be what Colin Powell, who was Reagan's national security advisor, called a good demon, to keep the bad demon in check. But at the end of this war, at the end of the Iran-Iraq war, at the very end of Reagan's administration,
the analog to good trouble.
Yeah, exactly. And they found that there was no good demon, and Saddam's regime increasingly ran afoul of international norms and the kind of world that the Reagan and then the Bush 41 administrations wanted to create as the Cold War was winding down. And of course, this would culminate with Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, which we can continue talking about. But Saddam Hussein's regime, more than anything else, contributed the idea of rogue regimes, rogue dictators seeking to build and even use weapons of mass destruction, which of course includes nuclear weapons, but also includes biological and chemical weapons, which Saddam's regime actually employed repeatedly in its war with Iran, as well as against its own people at the end of the 1980s.
So I think, I'm going to ask you a little bit about the lessons for today, but certainly today, the topic of preemption and its standing under international law is a hotly debated topic. What can we learn about preemption, which is one of the things talked about and actually exercised in Iraq? What can we learn about preemption and the debate around preemption, especially its relationship to international law, from your book?
Yes. Well, I found that so many of these elements of what would become a strategy against rogue states that the George W. Bush administration would employ against Iraq, so many of these elements were issues of fierce debate and disagreement within the Reagan administration and the Bush 41 administration. And so various key officials under Reagan and Reagan himself debated these things back and forth. And for example, under Reagan, two of the most critical advisors were the Secretary of State, George Shultz, and the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger. In the Cold War context, Weinberger was known as the Cold Warrior, the Cold War hawk, wanting to take a hard line against the Soviets, and George Shultz was the one wanting to seek negotiations and find a peaceful resolution to the standoff. But with the issues that I found, their stances were the mirror to this. And Shultz was the one pushing to make more robust use of American military force. hopefully to propel diplomacy toward a successful conclusion, but to be used in a preemptive way if necessary. So Schultz was really the one pushing this idea of the legitimacy of preemption. During the Libya crisis, it was actually one of Ronald Reagan's closest allies, Margaret Thatcher, who pushed back against this idea of preemptive military action and said that, and she was a stickler for at least her interpretation of international law, and she felt that taking retaliatory action, preemptive action, would not stand the test of international law. And so she advocated that the Americans, if they didn't change course, at least reframe their justification to thinking of any use of the military as an act of self-defense. And George Shultz was more than happy to incorporate that into the justification, and he also had a memorable quips for framing these issues, and said that if this type of preemptive military action against rogue states, against terrorist attacks, if that was not allowed under the UN Charter, then it was nothing more than a suicide pact. And so that was Schultz's view. Now, coming out of this pairing of military force and diplomacy came the idea of coercive diplomacy, which would be used in a number of the crises over the course of this period, starting with the Falklands War, moving ahead, of course, to the Gulf War, and then, perhaps most famously with the lead up to the Iraq War in 2002 and 2003, with the idea that in order to propel a negotiated or a diplomatic solution to crises involving rogue despots like Saddam Hussein, they needed, the U.S. and its allies needed to have a credible military force ready to be used and ready to push these rogues to the negotiating table. I think one of the most ironic findings of my study is that while this idea of coercive diplomacy often resulted in a successful outcome in the sense of toppling the rogue dictators, it very rarely resulted in not needing to use military force. And so one of the ironies of coercive diplomacy is that very rarely has it resulted, at least in this context, in not needing to resort to the coercion part of the equation. That was true in Iraq, and we've seen more recently that being true in Iran and Venezuela as well.
One of the things that's striking, and I guess obvious in retrospect from your book, is how the events of September 11th really consolidate all of these various pieces that are floating around into what you might call grand strategy. Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, and especially the role of public opinion? I was struck as from your answer to the first question about what an impact that those events made on you as how old were you?
I was 10 years old.
As a 10-year-old. I had to give a lecture to some undergraduates the morning after the attacks on the World Trade Center. And I have never, I'm a political historian, I have, in my cumulative 35 years of teaching, I maybe had 2 people ask me how they could do public service. I had 7 people line up after the lecture and ask me how they can get involved, what they can do for the United States of America. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about the impact of public opinion as a force for perhaps congealing or consolidating what you describe as grand strategy, although I get the sense that you don't like to use that term.
Yes, well, and you've mentioned earlier the with respect to the American policymakers stumbling along. Part of what I argue is, as you've alluded to, is that the American post-Cold War grand strategy was really created in an improvised way and created, I would say, in reverse. And what I mean by that is that scholars often debate whether policymakers, whether strategists create a fully baked grand strategy and then seek to implement it in the world, or whether they simply muddle through and figure things out as they go along. And I think what this story shows is that actually both are true. Over the course of the 1980s, each of the crises that I illuminate was unexpected and forced an improvised reaction on the part of the Americans. It wasn't something that they had fully planned out and then rolled out a strategy to fight back. It was a process of learning, stumbling along, and only after the fact did the Reagan and Bush administrations figure out, here's what happened, and let's piece it together into some kind of a coherent architecture for American strategy after the Cold War. And so they did pull together, a grand strategy of the sort, but it wasn't something that was fully cooked ahead of time. It was something that was pulled together in reverse after the key crises that had contributed to it. And part of what propelled the Reagan and Bush administrations to address these issues more seriously, to figure out some way to approach them, was public opinion. For example, terrorist violence over the course of the 80s was an increasing concern, more and more frequent by the middle of the decade, more and more casualties, more and more American targets, and that forced Reagan's hand to figure out some way to address it. But even though I argue that by the end of the Gulf War, these principles and these emergent strategies that the Reagan and Bush administrations pulled together, including regime change, including preemptive military force against rogue states, these were still topics of debate. And American leaders after the Cold War had to figure out how to apply them to a world that was much messier than the Cold War and much messier even than the Gulf War, which was a crystallizing moment for the creation of this new framework. But after the end of the Cold War, when the threats were murkier, the problems were muddier, it was less and less clear how to apply this precedent, this emergent strategy to the problems that cropped up. But 9/11 changed that. That was a moment, another crystallizing moment for this threat, where the strategies that Reagan, Schultz, Bush, and their teams had pieced together that were only implemented piecemeal before that because public opinion was still divided. 9/11 crystallized public opinion, congressional opinion, as well as the administration's opinion, which, as I noted under Reagan and Bush, were often divided. But it crystallized all of these key constituents behind behind the strategies that had their roots in this earlier period. And so in the aftermath of 9/11, the George W. Bush administration had really an unprecedented opportunity to implement the strategies that had their roots in the earlier period but had never been clearly implemented before.
Terrific. So two related questions to finish with, and then I hope we can field questions from the audience. If President Trump called you 2 months ago for advice on what to do with Iran, to Iran, what would you have told him based on your understanding of, in some ways, some very similar situations with that?
Yes. Well, I would say, for one thing, the history of rogues and the history of, as I said, the coercive diplomacy against rogue regimes and the dictators in charge of them. The history of the coercive diplomacy strategy is one that ends in war. It has in almost every case. And so I think one of the key things that each of these stories, each of these crises tell us is that rogue regimes don't change their spots willingly. And secondly, that it's much harder to change a rogue state, to seek regime change than we might think or hope. Now, I don't think that necessarily means that therefore it shouldn't be attempted and it's a horrible, bad idea. Because I think, ironically, one of the cases that has been held up as as a wise foreign policy decision, which is George H.W. Bush's decision not to march on Baghdad, not to seek to topple Saddam Hussein after the Gulf War, while made for, I think, very sound strategic reasons.
You would have said that to President Trump 2 months ago?
Well, I think
the call would have ended abruptly. I'm just saying. At any rate, go ahead.
Well, I would say that I'm not surprised that it is more difficult to change a regime from the air. I think George H.W. Bush found that, which is what I mean, that at the end of the Gulf War, which did end in a ground war, but limited to Kuwait, which did not march to Baghdad, set up even more ripe conditions than we're seeing now for regime change in Iraq, and it did not happen. It took a direct invasion of that country to do that. And so I think that frankly, if President Trump is very serious about changing the regime in Iran, I think he needs to consider using ground troops. Now, that might be a non-starter, and therefore maybe the overall goal should be rethought. But in the case of Panama and in the case of Iraq, a ground war was necessary in order to change those regimes.
And my second question is, if he calls tonight, what are you going to tell him? Where we are right now, regardless of what you thought about his decision roughly 2 months ago, or 6 weeks ago?
Well, I would say that one aspect that distinguishes what's happening now from what happened in the 80s and early 90s under Reagan and Bush is the use of allies. I think in both in the 80s and 90s, Reagan and Bush were both believed enough in their approaches and the rightness of their missions and strategies that they were willing to go alone, whether that meant without congressional approval or without the approval of allies. But both of those administrations worked exceptionally hard to convince allies that they wanted and needed the support to take seriously these threats that at that point were still seen as peripheral, secondary. And I would say in a similar way, I think a lot of Americans were surprised in January that, what's happening in Venezuela, the problems down, everyone kind of knew, there's problems down there, but that's not front and center, that's peripheral. And the story of Reagan and Bush 41 was to bring these peripheral issues into a central focus with the public as well as with allies. And I think that the Trump administration has not pursued either of those avenues as robustly. And so I think that that's a key difference that we're seeing.
Great. Well, let's take some questions from you all. Yes. Why don't you just call on?
All right, Jacob.
So, impartiality is a virtue. Impartiality is a virtue of a historian, one that I think you really exemplify. One way to gain that is just by temporal distance. So we don't really care about the goings on of King John or King Henry II. They're not our problems, right? But these problems that you're thinking about kind of are our problems. So how do you do it? Like, how do you remain so impartial? The sliding from history to like talking to Trump was like the same person. So how do you do that?
Well,
it's awesome.
I appreciate that. Well, it is, of course, it's always challenging for historians, I suppose, to draw clear-cut lessons to the present day, or at least that's something that that certainly takes practice and so on. But I would say that in studying these periods of recent history, and particularly in our context of the Chase Center, I think, my work is some of the most recent of all of the faculty here. But I think that one important thing in my own research is that the 1980s and early 90s, the Reagan and Bush years, do have archival sources open. And I think it makes a huge difference to be able to peek behind the curtain, so to speak, to see what exactly presidents and their advisors, and not just within administrations, but among allies, among the public, but what is actually going on in these deliberations, and how does that stack up with public justifications and public commentary? I found that, at least with Reagan and Bush 41 and their teams of advisors, that more often than not, the way that they spoke about these issues publicly matched how they were discussing them privately. For example, during the lead up to the Gulf War, George Bush 41 frequently compared Saddam Hussein to Adolf Hitler and the lead up to World War II. And many people, and this was a midterm election year, the midterm elections in 1990 coincided with the buildup of American forces at that time. And many critics of Bush said, he's trumping this up as comparing Saddam to Hitler as a campaign tactic to try to scare everybody into war. And actually, it's come out through George Bush kept an audio diary. Ronald Reagan kept a written diary. And in Bush's radio diary, in the minutes of meetings, if anything, Bush made this comparison of Saddam and Hitler even more stridently in private, and even just speaking into his microphone in the darkened halls of the White House at night. And so, what I think that shows is that yes, that's how he interpreted this problem, and it's critical to have the records to be able to compare. And of course, we don't have that today, and so I think that as historians, being able to study a period when archives are available, and of course hopefully that will continue through the 90s into the 2000s into the present day, makes a huge difference in being able to understand things in a more impartial light that kind of removes it from the passions of the moment.
So I'm curious. I mean, I lived through this, so I suppose I should know it better than I do. But I'm curious. You haven't really talked about for these three regimes, Panama, Libya, Iraq. Haven't talked much about like the ideology behind the regimes. So that, of course, under the Cold War, that was huge. We've got these people who are just taken over by this communist view of the world. It's interesting that you just mentioned Hitler, the comparisons between Saddam Hussein and Hitler, because Saddam Hussein, he's just this kind of, Ba'athist kind of, he was kind of communist-ish, but like not really hardcore communist. They were always kind of in the left orbit of things. But I'm curious to the extent to which they were really thinking like, oh yeah, all the ideological stuff is just complete nonsense, and the extent to which, if you look at Iran, that's a little different, because they might just be like, nah, it's just like there's no negotiating with these people. They're just like ready for the end of the world. If you take what some of them say seriously. So to what extent are they kind of debunking ideology or misrepresenting it, or this Hitler stuff seems, it seems a little over the top, but just ideology.
Well, I think you're absolutely right that ideology and the question of where that fits into this new framework is a critical one, because of course what I argue the rogue state paradigm is replacing, which is the anti-communist framework animating America's role in the world during the Cold War, was of course intensely grounded in ideology. And people like Ronald Reagan saw the Cold War as a battle of ideas. But I think your question also gives me a good opportunity to explain a little bit another puzzle that came out of my research, which is, what about Iran? And of course, today, that's a wonderful question.
I threatened to ask you that.
And yes, so I better preempt that. Of course, Iran was one of the foremost state sponsors of terror in the 1980s.
Aimed directly at America.
Exactly, and a critical and prominent nemesis of America since the 1979 Islamist Revolution. And as I said earlier, during the Iran-Iraq War, the Reagan administration saw Iran as the bad demon and Iraq as the good demon. And so where does Iran fit? And I found that during this formative period for rogue states, and of course Iran has proven one of the most quintessential rogue states in the post-Cold War world, and certainly fits into any definition of a rogue. But during this formative period, when the idea was triggered and was just taking root, I found that Iran actually did not play as large of a role in that process as I expected. And I think there are a few reasons for that. First of all, I think in the 80s especially, the Reagan administration saw Iran as a related problem, but really a major problem in its own right that was somewhat distinct from this emerging rogue state idea. And I think a key reason for that, as Chris, as you've hinted at, is the question of ideology. So on one hand, we have a radical Islamist regime in Iran whose threat, at least in the eyes of the United States, was tied to its radical ideology and the threat of spreading that throughout the Middle East. And by contrast, these emerging rogue states were, the problems tied with them were more the erratic ambitions of individual dictators. And now one of the criticisms of the idea of framing America's approach to the world in terms of rogue states is that, aren't you lumping together these very dissimilar countries and threats into one basket and trying to impose a one-size-fits-all problem on that? And I've actually found that from the beginning, Reagan, Bush, Schultz, their teams recognized that Libya, Panama, Iraq, and so on pose different challenges, different problems. And so by discussing them in this way, they weren't shortchanging a uniquely tailored approach to each one. But they did share certain characteristics, and those characteristics were tied to these individual rogue dictators, Gaddafi of Libya, Noriega of Panama, Saddam Hussein of Iraq, whose threats were more tied to the individual and non-ideological features of these administrations seeking weapons of mass destruction and sponsoring terrorism, and as well as drug trafficking and so on. And the only ideological tie there really was pushing back against the emerging American-led post-Cold War order, but not the same type of ideology as Iran. And at the same time as these rogue states, like the trio that I've described, were on the rise and seeming to be an increasingly urgent problem, the end of the Iran-Iraq War left Iran weakened, chastened, and perhaps its power on the wane. And that's part of the opportunity that led Americans to reevaluate their relationship with Iraq. So even though Iran was, intimately tied to the problem, it was something a little bit different during this formative period. Of course, that would change. Yeah.
If there were a lefty in the room, the rejoinder would be that the designation rogue is just an ideological attachment to veil or rationalize the actions of imperialism. What's the answer to that?
Well, I would say and this also gets back to the question of whether America just invented this, this type of threat, as a bad guy for the post-Cold War world, which I've said I don't think was the case. But part of the reason that rogue states rose to such prominence during this moment, this transitional moment from Cold War to post-Cold War, in part had to do with America's increased freedom of action in this period. During the Cold War, these international troublemakers, and of course Saddam Hussein had held power since the late 1970s, so he didn't pop up at the very end of the Cold War out of the blue. But the Cold War limited America's freedom of action for how to address these kinds of threats. And so in that sense, the creation of a strategy against rogues was facilitated by the fact that America could, in a sense, impose its strategies and solve the problems as it felt necessary. But that said, I also try to make clear that this was not an invented threat. These issues that converged into the rogue state framework that I describe were very real threats that America was often struggling to figure out what to do about. And so the idea that the label of rogues is just an ideological, demeaning term imposed by, American imperialism, I think overlooks the fact that these regimes did share important characteristics that acutely threatened the international order that America and its allies hoped to build at the end of the Cold War. So it wasn't just an American imposition, but one that the rogues themselves played the lion's share of the role in fostering.
Thank you. I was handed the microphone and said this was the last question. So I want to return to something that's come up a couple times episodically, and that is the role of international norms, what you referred to a few times here. Because it does strike me the culmination of your book is this moment in which the U.S., as you mentioned, rallies the UN and all of this to sort of engage in this, when you think about it, sort of remarkable coordination against Iraq in the first Gulf War. And now we live in this moment where there's a lot of discussion. I welcome your thoughts on it. That international order that emerged after the Cold War, which I was in college, and we felt this great enthusiasm and excitement that maybe things were going to work out. The wall had come down. It seems like we're in a different moment now, and so I wonder the extent to which the people you're looking at are genuinely convinced that this international order is what it is being fought for, and that the rogue doesn't just mean against American interests, but rogue means they have not bought into the international law as manifested by what, fill in the blank, international court, the UN, and whether that is still true today, or whether we're, in other words, what lessons?
Right. Well, I try to draw a couple of contrasts in the beginning and end of the book, and in my introduction I include a picture from the last summit meeting between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, with the addition of George H.W. Bush, who had just been elected president, Reagan's vice president at the time, and it's a famous picture with the three of them smiling and the Statue of Liberty behind them.
This is the Statue of Liberty.
Yes, so, yes, you can see there, and just as you said, it kind of symbolizes this dawning era of freedom and peace and hope and so on. But then a few minutes later, and
cover.
Circling back.
What's in the background?
Yes, the background there.
Any New Yorkers here?
Twin Towers.
It's the Twin Towers.
Exactly, and of course they couldn't know
Same
that
three
symbolism.
people. I think that's a brilliant use of photographs. I really congratulate you.
Well,
The photograph at the beginning of the story and the one on the cover is the end, and it's in the book too. And it's just actually one of the most effective use of photographs I've ever seen.
Well, thank you. I was glad that the publisher agreed to use it for the cover, since it's been, as Brianna will tell you, on my desk ever since the beginning of the project, since I think it really encapsulates the contrast between the hopefulness of this end of the Cold War moment for creating a new world with the of course looming tragedy to come that of course they could only guess at. I also draw another contrast between the beginning and the end of the book, and one of the first crises that I look at was the Falklands War, and this was a case that I argue was a moment where the Reagan administration viewed this crisis, which really didn't fit into the Cold War, through a Cold War lens, and therefore didn't really know how to handle it effectively. And Margaret Thatcher and the British felt that it was a case of fighting for an international principle or norm, that non-aggression can't be rewarded through allowing it to stand. And I draw the contrast between this moment where Reagan and his administration respond to that, providing support to the British, but also trying to take an even-handed approach and direct attention away from that principle at stake, to the end of the book and the culminating moment, what I call the formative precedent for the Cold War world in the Gulf War, this moment of unprecedented international cooperation and coalition building, where George Bush argues that what was at stake in this tiny little sheikdom of Kuwait was not just a defense of a wronged tiny little country, but a vital international principle and norm. And what had changed, of course, was the international context that all this was happening. And President Bush framed his entire strategy during the Gulf War, including his desire to build a big international coalition, around wanting to set a durable precedent for a post-Cold War order that would be about defending international norms, where a large state couldn't just roll tanks into a smaller state. And even if America's interests weren't threatened, and of course Bush also argued that America's interests were threatened in the Gulf, but even if that were not the case, it would still be worth going to war to defend these norms. And one of the major ways that Bush's Secretary of State, James Baker, who had also been part of all these debates going back to the early Reagan administration, Baker helped to get the Soviet Union on board with this coalition, at least in a limited degree, by arguing that, hey, we're trying to build a new world order based on international norms of acceptable behavior that states like Saddam Hussein's Iraq were flagrantly violating in their view. And what good is having these norms and having this new world order if we're not willing to defend those norms, which is part of the critical justification for the Gulf War. And now fast forward to today and what this means for our present world. When I started my research, one of the common lines among scholars of American foreign relations and grand strategy was that actually this focus on rogue states after 9/11 and this focus on a global war on terror was a mistake. America took its eye off the ball of focusing on the real threats of Russia, China, and so on. And I think, in my own opinion, one of the lessons of today is that actually we're still very much in this post-Cold War world order that Reagan and Bush 41 helped build, that Bush 43 accelerated. And for better or for worse, many of these same problems are still defining problems of our world today. Now we're transitioning towards something else, and so we're moving into a period of learning and recalibration, once again. But I think if we can take a lesson from the Reagan and Bush 41 years, it's that being willing to learn and adapt and figure out new strategies is a humbling process, but one that can be successfully done, since what emerged after the Gulf War, imperfect as it was, also had many successes for creating the world that we're in today, not just for worse, but also for better. So I'll leave it at that.
Great.
Thank you very much.